Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video, we're going to be concentrating on the top 10 quotes from Jekyll and Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. But before I get into that, I'd love for you to hit subscribe to join my tribe for all things English, literary, and grammatical. Before I go any further, I just want to clarify I've chosen just one quote from every chapter that I think offers us an insight into many themes and the many characters that we need to concentrate on in any given essay. So, first piece of evidence from chapter 1. He's not easy to describe. There's something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. Mr. Enfield is referring back to the strange creature, man, who tramples on the girl. And this imagery that he creates of vagueness creates a sense of fear of the unknown that's across the novella. I get a sense of the uncanny too. And I think not just the vague imagery, but the persistence of alliteration, which stresses not only the ugliness of the character, but how hard it is to pin down exactly what their attributes are, as alarming. Placing this into the context of Victorian Britain with a fascination on physiognomy, the study that equated your physical attributes to your ability to be a criminal mastermind or not, we get an insight into why this unnamed character, which creates mystery, is a dangerous one. We'll later learn this is Mr. Hyde. We'll also learn of the hatred that runs alongside the imagery that Enfield is painting in our minds. But the suspense in the ominous is not just accentuated by the alliteration, but is also the consistent reminder that there's something wrong. It's displeasing, it's detestable, it's how many ways we can offer up the discomfort that this individual has prompted. Next up, in chapter 2, I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake. As they say, I see and I have seen devilish little of the man. Such unscientific balderdash, says Dr. Lanyon. So this is prompting suspicion. This used to be a close friend of Dr. Jekyll's, but now he sees devilish little of the man. I think the significant use of the adjective devilish accentuates this idea that Lanyon no longer trusts him. And there's an intellectualizing that goes on across this novella about science. Here, Lanyon describes the philosophy in chapter 2 that Jekyll has as unscientific balderdash. And it's fascinating to me that we never really get to learn about the science. We do get an insight into his fear of ideas, about the passion with which these scientists consider their science, but the fact that we as readers are never really shown the scientific facts in all their glory means that there's almost another sense of fear and mystery, the unknown, that we don't get to see. A fear of ideas, if you like. We get a critique of freedom of information from this piece of evidence. And I think it's fascinating that there's evil hinted at here, not just with the adjective devilish, but this idea that it's unscientific, it's not proven. I question whether Lanyon is too wedded to science. But this character, Dr. Lanyon, as much as he claims suspiciously that he's no longer friends or close to Jekyll, later in the novella he will come to the rescue of his friend. So there's a reference to Damon and Pythias in this chapter, straight after this piece of evidence. They are two friends that, one who was prepared to die for the other, just so that they could reach out for their family. That reference to friendship is ever present. So let's move on to chapter 3. The large, handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale to the very lips, and there came a blackness about his eyes. I do not care to hear more, said he. Again, the physical description of the handsome face, the good face of the respectable Dr. Jekyll is now growing pale. We're told it grew pale to the very lips. There's something about the lips as the main organ with which we can share and vocalize what we're scared to share ordinarily. Fascinatingly, he's talking to Mr. Utterson, and Jekyll does not utter a word here. But more than that, there's a blackness about his eyes. This is physiologically a reaction of panic. The blood is no longer flowing to his lips. His eyes look drained of colour beneath them, at least. It's a sensual overload, not just because we associate the lips with tasting, but also the eyes with sight, and more so, I do not care to hear more. It suggests he's in some state of discomfort. We get the physiological reaction of fear, the recognition in these sensual images of evil that is latent in these quite dark images, the sense of danger, and clearly that of secrecy. By the end of this chapter, Utterson has pledged at the start of the chapter that he shall find out and unpack what is happening with his dear friend. But by the end of this chapter, he's pledged to his friend that he shall never bring this subject of Mr. Hyde up again. This is in response directly to the prying and probing from Utterson that doesn't go far enough to resolving this problem. If you want to follow the physiognomy kind of style of argument to say that the physical description here echoes a sense of evil, I think we definitely have some evidence of that around the blackness of his eyes and the way that his lips grew pale. But I think more than that, it's the contrast between those negative connotations and the idea that his large, handsome face has retreated in some way to these shriveled up qualities. So chapter 4, we witness a violent crime, or it's relayed to us through a maid. All of a sudden, he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane, and carrying on, as the maid described it, like a madman. So here we have a full-fledged crime. Sir Danvers Carew, a politician of note, is being beaten up as an old man by, well, a madman. The simile at the end of our piece of evidence is significant. The barbaric imagery, the sudden nature of how he broke out in a great flame of anger, that violent association of the flame of anger is so emotive for us. But more than that, stamping with his foot. Again, the last time we saw stamping was when the girl was trampled upon. Brandishing, again, it's a weapon that's being brandished, but this time it's the brandishing of a cane, a gentleman's cane associated with propriety. Now he's using this unorthodox weapon, beating both this politician of reputation stakes high with the gentlemanly weapon of the cane to walk properly in society. It's almost an ironic twist of fate. The metaphor that is this great flame of anger accentuates the violence and evil tyranny of Hyde, but equally the mystery of this unprovoked attack, like a madman, shows this unhinged quality which makes us fearful as readers. By chapter 5, we see and witness the consequences of how Jekyll is left to feel. Upon rereading, this is made ever clearer to us. As we read, even in the houses the fog began to lie thickly, as there, close to the warmth, sat Dr. Jekyll, looking deathly sick. The notion of fog in your house is unusual, to say the least. We know at this point that Stevenson is using the pathetic fallacy of the fog. That means we cannot see what's ahead of us. The mystery of it all is heightened. But in Jekyll's home, close to the warmth, he looks deathly sick. There's an element of the Gothic here. The fog's lying directly above where he chooses to sit. He's close to the warmth, but he still looks so deeply unwell. It's this mythic kind of evil, ominous struggle. The deathly sick, especially the adverb deathly, accentuates his struggle. The juxtaposition of the light elsewhere, maybe from the flames that are the warmth or what is around, but darkness and confusion in this setting suggests the isolation of Jekyll. And in response to this murder of Sir Danvers Carew that Hyde has committed, it casts suspicion for us as readers about the connection between these two characters as we start reading. By chapter 6, we encounter one of the most pivotal pieces of evidence from Jekyll that acknowledges his suffering at large. He says, if I am the chief of sinners, I am the chief of sufferers also. The repetition of chief implies some sort of power, but the juxtaposition between the sinner and the sufferer is ever real. Now, there's a biblical reference to the chief of sinners. Actually, in the first book in Timothy, the biblical book of Timothy, Paul acknowledges that there is indeed a chief of sinners, and that, Jesus Christ living through him has given him eternal hope. But here, that is against the chief of sufferers, the sense that those who've chosen to do wrong. We've got a sense that Jekyll is indulging in self-pity and to some extent not really understanding the guilt or shame that needs to be at work here. It's interesting that chief has these connotations of power, because there's an element of powerlessness about how this sounds, especially when we hear the sibilance of sinner and sufferer. We're really forced to see the strain he is under. Our next piece of evidence comes from the shortest chapter of the novella, the chapter that concentrates on the incident at the window. And I want to take you to the moment where we're told they were both pale and there was an answering horror in their eyes. As if it wasn't apparent enough, they have seen Jekyll showing some incredibly disturbing qualities when they have checked in on him. There's horror in their eyes in what they have seen. Again, we've got this sensual engagement. They're both pale. That's a physiological reaction to what they've observed, which echoes, by the way, the physiological reaction of Jekyll in chapter 3 when he's caught off guard. But the answering horror in their eyes, the eyes as Victorians would have seen it, were the gateway to the soul. The horror is the connection they are forming in their minds and their genuine concern. What's fascinating is the fact that these two individuals do very little to support Jekyll in that moment. So chapter 8 is a fascinating hinge point in the novella. The piece of evidence I want to share with you is there was borne in upon his mind a crushing anticipation of calamity. This is the process of thought that the narrator casts upon Utterson as he and Poole travel to Jekyll's house. This is because Poole has come to fetch Utterson in a state of fear and heightened danger. London in this portion of the novella is so deserted, we're told. There's a lack of connection here. And now we're in the mind of Utterson. This crushing anticipation of calamity, the repetition of the k sound is quite aggressive for us. We're told in the same part of the novella that the thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing. Nature is struggling. But that word calamity, echoed with crushing, accentuates this sense of threat. And we know we're about to fully expose what's been going on. But we also acknowledge that Utterson is beginning to recognise there is something much more deeply wrong than he'd pieced at this point with Jekyll. Now, by the time we get to chapter 9, we are encountering the experience that Lanyon has in the laboratory. And these are the words of Hyde, who says, "Your sight shall be blasted by a prodigy to stagger the unbelief of Satan." Wow, strong language if ever I heard it. I think the sibilance, sight shall stagger Satan, definitely plays into the power of evil that we see as synonymous with Hyde. The sense of fear is real. The violent image of being blasted is another linked image to the idea of the flame of anger that we also associate with Hyde from chapter 4. But this stagger, the unbelief, it's as if there is some sort of mad magic trick that we're about to see, of villainy. The sense of fear is made clear in the way that Lanyon relays this in his letter. But the voyeurism, the sense of passivity that he can do nothing but watch Hyde do bad things, is part of the gothic elements that people loved in thrillers that we call the shilling shockers. And that sense that there is a victim and that Hyde is the criminal is a definitive hallmark of the shilling shocker and this text as a whole. Last but not least, chapter 10. Jekyll writes, "Man is not truly one, but truly two." That sense of the juggle between good and evil, the power of that duality in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that represent good and evil respectively, but also that conflict. It's a broader tapestry to question and push back out on the reader that none of us is truly pure or truly a criminal, that instead each of us has a quality that could turn for good or to turn for bad. And actually we have choices. So much of this novella is questioning Victorian sense of propriety and reputation. And Stevenson does a huge amount to unearth for us that the idea that someone is a pure villain or a purely perfect individual is false. But also so much to unearth about fear, evil, and truly that adverb in that piece of evidence suggests that the honest reality is that we can be both. Lots to think about, but I hope it helps you on your revision journey.